San Francisco. This is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, new data protection rules known as GDPR are now being enforced in Europe. Tech companies had months to prepare, but are they ready? Plus, the Trump administration has reached an agreement that will allow ZTE to remain in business. We will discuss how the deal was sealed and what it means for trade talks between the U.S. and China. And SpaceX completes its 10th mission this year. Meantime, China launches a satellite that ushers in a new era in the global space race. We will discuss who's in the lead. But first to our top story, the new era of consumer privacy has also arrived, consumer data privacy. Europe's General Data Protection Regulation went into effect Friday in an effort to safeguard the electronic data of European citizens. Here is everything you need to know.
The EU is introducing new rules which will dramatically impact how companies collect, store and use data. It's called the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. Coming into effect on May the 25th, it applies to any company that collects personal data of EU citizens. So what will change for customers? Instead of fine print and legal jargon, companies will have to post clear notices and get unambiguous consent to collect personal information. That includes credit card numbers, travel records and even biometric data from wearable fitness monitors. And these rules don't just apply to social networking sites and search engines. It affects schools, property management companies, and even scout groups. If there's a breach, companies with more than 250 employees need to notify authorities within 72 hours and alert customers. So situations like Uber's attempts to cover up its 2016 data hack will now be punishable with huge fines. Just how huge? Up to $24.8 million, or 4% of global annual revenue. For a company with worldwide sales of $100 billion, that could mean penalties of $4 billion in certain circumstances. That's a pretty good incentive to comply, and firms are scrambling to make sure they'll meet the deadline.
For more on GDPR, let's get straight to Europe, where Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde is standing by. Caroline?
Emily, thank you very much indeed. Let's get more on the business and indeed the new legal implications of GDPR. Now it has taken effect, with Giles Pratt, partner at law firm Freshfields for intellectual property and information technology, and Julian Saunders, CEO of Port, the GDPR compliance tool. Gentlemen, wonderful to have you here. Julian, start with you. 18 months they had to get it in place, but still we understand some businesses aren't yet compliant. What have been the real challenges here?
Well, actually, it's 2 years that they've had to get ready. The challenges are that the regulations have been written in a principle-based manner. So this means that there are no clear guidelines. There are just principles that need to be adopted by businesses. And that means there's an enormous amount of flexibility in the interpretation of what's required.
Flexibility in interpretation. Let's get the interpretation of a lawyer. And Giles, what's also really interesting is a lot of these companies, as we're hearing about, are global in nature, but this is block in regulation. It's the EU. How does one company go around navigating that? Do they just make a policy for the EU, or does that make things even more complicated?
You're absolutely right. This is a global question that businesses ask themselves, because data privacy is really up the agenda internationally these days. Really what we're seeing clients look to do is raise the bar internationally to a certain level, particularly on things like data security. So they're focused on some of the core EU principles and applying them worldwide. But some of the rights that individuals get in the EU, they just don't gel very well with what businesses are doing internationally. So sometimes it's worth having a couple of speeds to make sure that your business isn't really working with one hand tied behind its back in markets where it can do more.
Talking about the hands behind the back, Julian, I mean, you're working with companies to try and get them compliant. And are there any opportunities to make this work for them, to improve their transparency, their brand recognition, or is this generally a challenge for many a business rather than an opportunity?
It's a very big opportunity. Pardon me. It's a very big opportunity for many businesses. The real challenge at the moment is getting compliance and just ticking those boxes that make people feel comfortable. But when businesses get to grips with GDPR, they'll realise that actually there's a big opportunity to improve their trust, to be open and transparent with their customers, build better relationships, and also to access actually more data than they previously had access to, because data portability is a very big aspect of these new regulations.
Explain that a little bit more. What about the data portability?
So data portability is one of the fundamental rights. There's been a lot spoken around right to be forgotten, as an example, and we've all heard that we can go and request that we have our information deleted from businesses. But more interestingly, we can also go and request access and a copy of all of our data and related information inside an organisation, and we can have that delivered to us in machine-readable format or actually shared with another business, and that information can be used to provide personalised products and services that actually suit our history, even though our history may not be with the company that's now providing that personalisation. So there's an enormous opportunity for innovation around access to that greater amount of data.
That's why many people citing blockchain to become some sort of use case in this. But Giles, going back to the right to be forgotten, this is one that we all love to cling to because it's got a catchy name, but how will the right to be forgotten actually be to enact, or indeed, how will the challenges there be interpreted by businesses?
Yeah, you're right. The buzzword has really confused people a bit, and this is not as if that we're in a world where everyone's data is going to suddenly be erased. What actually happens if you're a business and you receive a request from someone who asks for you to erase their data, you can look at that and decide, well, have I got a defence to that request? And in many circumstances, and we've seen this time and time again with people trying to maybe game some of the new rules, we've seen businesses actually plan for that and think about, well, how the hell they will kind of politely but firmly say no when actually they need to keep that information for a legitimate purpose. That might be because they've got a dispute with the person who says, please forget me. Of course, in that scenario, the law needs to find a way to get through.
Julian, talking about gaming or not, as the case may be, already we've seen 4 complaints lodged in the first day by Max Schrems against Google and Facebook, several of its units, saying that, look, the way you are forcing people to accept these new privacy rules and you're just all too important. Talk to us about that potential case and how you think it might be interpreted.
So, again, there's a fundamental aspect of GDPR whereby a business cannot withhold provision of a service pending the individual agreeing to having all their data accessed for any purpose. So, Max Schrems' argument is that those large organisations are really saying, take it or leave it. Yeah. If you don't want to use our service, then don't use it. If you do, you have to give us all of your information and you have to let us use it the way we want to use it. And really, that isn't what the intention of the GDPR is. It is to actually give incremental levels of consent around areas of data use that enable the individual to have much more control around where their data is going and how it's being used and who it's being shared with.
It's interesting about how the control of data, does it affect the value of data, Giles? Because you're talking not only to businesses but to potential investors in businesses. And data was the gold of modern day. Are companies that want to buy data-focused businesses having to stop and think? Are they talking to you about it?
Yeah, they absolutely are, and this has really become a focus for businesses, not just because of GDPR, but because data privacy as a real kind of value point has been there growing over the past 5, maybe 10 years. What we see now is businesses wanting, when they are talking to investors and when investors are scrutinising what they're doing, we're seeing a real dialogue around exactly how the technologists in a business and maybe the lawyers and the compliance team have thought together about how they're going to build a modular system. You know, to Julian's point, you get a huge amount of value out of all of this data, and it's brilliant when the individuals can actually kind of be able to push and pull on that in a modular way. If a business has built its systems so that they can switch off something that a user doesn't want, that means it's going to be scalable. It's going to be ready for the future. It might well be kind of there for GDPR. That's what investors are looking for.
We've talked about the opportunities, the challenges. There's one particular challenge that is still out there, and Julian, get your point on 72-hour rule. You know, a company suddenly is given, potentially has a breach. How on earth do they go about talking to the regulators about that?
It's a really difficult area for businesses. Many businesses can have breaches with no knowledge of that, and particularly smaller businesses. It's putting a lot of onus on security for businesses of all sizes. Medium-sized businesses struggle really to have the adequate resources to properly secure their perimeters, and to be aware of when they're breached, and then to be able to react very quickly is going to be extremely tough.
Yeah, no, look, I do agree with that. 72 hours is obviously a hugely short period of time. Most people, if they do suffer from a crisis, need at least a week, maybe two, to run some of the forensics to actually understand what's happened. What businesses are really doing, and we've seen a lot of this with our clients, is thinking about how they're going to plan for that. What are they going to do on day one? How do they escalate? How do they show that, effectively bad things can happen to good people? They might have their policies, procedures in place, but they're able to work through it. No one's going to be completely safe from a cyber attack, and businesses just need to have the processes to enable them to respond.
Feels like there's still plenty of questions to go and still some compliance to be met, certainly with expertise such as yours. People have still got plenty to learn. Thank you very much indeed. That, of course, was Giles Pratt with Freshfields and Julian Saunders, CEO of Port. Emily.
Caroline, thank you so much. We'll be back to you later on. Coming up, can China's second largest telecom equipment manufacturer be saved? We look at the past, present, and future of ZTE next. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. You can listen on the Bloomberg Radio app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on Sirius XM. This is Bloomberg. The Trump administration has reportedly reached a deal to keep China's second biggest telecom manufacturer alive. Bloomberg News has confirmed this. The White House told Congress that thanks to the agreement with the Commerce Department, ZTE would be paying a large fine. The deal also includes placing U.S. compliance officers inside ZTE and managerial changes, something Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross pointed to on Thursday. So, just how did ZTE wind up at the brink of closure? Bloomberg's Selena Wang takes a look.
Congress had been increasing pressure on President Donald Trump to not weaken sanctions on ZTE, which is the Chinese telecommunications equipment company that's been a flashpoint in U.S.-China relations. It's become a central focus ever since the administration crippled the company by cutting it off from U.S. suppliers for allegedly violating the terms of a 2017 sanctions settlement and then lying about it. The U.S. also alleges that the state-linked enterprise is involved in the transfer of U.S. technology to China's military. Now, Trump, who has emphasized his hardline stance on China, made an abrupt reversal earlier this month when he said he was working on a way to get ZTE back into business and fast. Take a listen at how Trump said he plans to punish ZTE.
What I envision is a very large fine of more than $1 billion, could be $1.3 billion. I envision a new management, a new board, and very, very strict security rules. And I also envision that they will have to buy a big percentage of their parts and equipment from American companies.
Lawmakers are critical of Trump's reconsideration of these penalties against ZTE as a way to make a favor to the country's president, Xi Jinping. They argue that ZTE should not be used as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations, and that softening the blow could cost U.S. credibility.
To further discuss, I want to bring in the voice you just heard explaining the ZTE situation, Bloomberg Tech, Selena Wang, and also in New York we have Asia Society Senior Fellow Isaac Stone-Fish. So, Selena, first of all, now we know the administration has decided to soften the blow here. How exactly would this compromise, this agreement, work?
This is what Trump has allegedly been talking about for the past several days. He wants to impose a larger fine on ZTE. He's going to put compliance officers into the company, which is a pretty big deal. They'll get a window into what ZTE is doing. However, if this does actually come into place, it will lift the ban on ZTE, which is already causing tons of ire from Congress. We've seen Marco Rubio tweet that this is a great deal for China and that it's a huge security risk. The main concern here is that Trump is conflating trade issues with national security and that he shouldn't be trading away national security concerns in order to be a bargaining chip in other issues. Now, ZTE did violate this sanctions in 2017. It's very clear, and they even lied about it later. And so weakening this blow, the concern here is that it's really going to weaken the ability of the U.S. in the future to really have credibility and be able to have bargaining power in the future.
Isaac, it's also, some might find it somewhat skeptical that the Chinese government would allow compliance officers inside a Chinese technology company. What do you make of this potential agreement here?
I think that's a really good point, especially a technology company that has such close ties to the state. I think one advantage of the U.S. side doing this deal is we would get a lot of insight into Huawei, which is China's largest telecoms company, its largest nominally private company, but in fact, something that functions as a de facto arm in some ways of the Chinese military and the Chinese state. So there'll be a lot of really valuable information gathering that the U.S. side could have on a national security angle. But I think you're right. I think it is very unlikely that Beijing will allow things that it considers state secrets to just be given wide open to the U.S.
Now, there's all of this happening against a very complicated backdrop. How much do you think the situation here really has to do with the sanctions that ZTE violated, with the coming of a potential trade war, and with the concern that ZTE actually is a national security threat?
I think it unfortunately has to do very little with the sanctions that ZTE violated, and so much more with the political situation right now. And I think that's a problem because it sends a message to U.S. and international firms that politics trumps economics and law. And it also sends a message to Beijing, which does a lot more of that than the United States does, that it's okay to have political issues and issues of trade and international relations be more important than your rule of law and your allegiance to how you do things. So I think it could give Beijing license to behave a little bit more unpredictably with American tech companies that are trying to succeed in China.
Selena, how does the cancellation of this summit with the North Koreans impact this?
Well, as we have seen, I mean, this, as Isaac said, this has become a huge flashpoint in U.S.-China relations, as well as the overall Asia-Pacific region with the United States. And now the concern here is, in fact, using this bargaining chip, and that this could eventually show American companies that the political issues could be a flashpoint for even greater problems. Now, the really big question here, though, is the Made in China 2025 industrial policy, and that a lot of the trade talks have not really been addressing this problem, and that in giving this concession to ZTE, it could actually encourage China to continue the IP theft that's been alleged, causing U.S. companies doing JVs in China to turn over some of their technology, and that everything that's happened so far only causes more impetus for China to make sure that they are technologically independent and that this situation won't happen again. And to get there, they want to out-innovate, and in order to do that, there may be even more IP theft and concerns with that in order to get there.
How big a risk, Isaac, is there of retaliation in China?
I think there is quite a large risk of retaliation, and I think the way that this will work is because there's so many other factors happening right now that are complicating the U.S.-China relationship. Besides North Korea, you have tensions on the military side with the U.S. disinviting China to an important naval exercise. So I think the retaliation, when it comes, won't be pegged to ZTE, but I think it'll be more of a wink-wink, nudge-nudge. Okay, I think you know why this company is getting audited or why this company can't get a license. They'll just leave some plausible deniability involved with it.
How could punishing ZTE in this way, Selena, lead to potential backlash against the U.S. administration more broadly?
Well, obviously, the great concern is that China could levy a similar problem on a lot of U.S. companies that are offering in China. Now, the big issue overall is that it's not a level playing field. Chinese companies have been able to, for the most part, invest abroad, although the U.S. is really putting greater clampdowns on that, whereas U.S. companies have historically had many issues operating in China. Obviously, there's the requirement that they have to sometimes transfer their technology. Now, so far, the impact on ZTE has been that it's been mostly crippled. It's lost about, $3 billion. It's still having operating expenses. It has tens of thousands of employees that are idle, but they are hopeful that if and when this concession comes through, that they can immediately put those workers back into action.
Isaac, how do you expect, this is obviously a very unpredictable U.S. administration. How do you expect this to evolve over the next days and weeks? Will this develop into a full-blown trade war?
I think you gave me a nice out there saying that this is such an unpredictable administration. And I think one way to track that is to see what goes on with the North Korean summit. So earlier on Friday, Trump said, oh, actually, the summit might happen on June 12th. And the summit is a good barometer for the U.S.-China relationship. If the summit happens, I think the U.S. side will be more willing to help out on trade issues and be less likely to really punish ZTE. However, if the summit doesn't happen, I think a lot of U.S. lawmakers will blame China. It's hard to know if it's China's fault or not, but I think they'll receive a lot of the blame. And I think ZTE could certainly be a casualty in that blame.
Isaac Stonefish of the Asia Society, always great to have you here on the show, as well as Bloomberg's Selena Wang. Thank you both. We will be following unpredictability and all. Coming up, the verdict is in for Apple versus Samsung. Why Samsung took a gamble with its appeal and lost. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Seven years after their patent infringement battle first started, Apple has won a $539 million verdict from Samsung. The original case was about Samsung infringing on 3 of Apple's iPhone designs, like rounded corners and its grid icon view. A jury in 2012 awarded Apple over $1 billion, though Samsung cut the award on appeal and eventually paid about $548 million, while continuing to challenge $399 million of that payment in court. So this means Samsung already paid $399 million for infringing the patents at issue, and this week's verdict would increase that amount due by $140 million. Samsung has said it will consider all options to obtain an outcome that does not hinder creativity and fair competition. Essential Products, co-founded by Android creator Andy Rubin, is considering selling itself and has canceled development of a new smartphone. People familiar with the matter say. The startup has hired Credit Suisse as an advisor. It was valued at up to $1 billion about a year ago, this according to Equidate. An Indonesian ride-hailing company, Gojek, says it's more focused on expanding its footprint than going public. Gojek, Indonesia's first billion-dollar startup, began talks with taxi operators in Singapore in an effort to compete with Grab, Southeast Asia's biggest ride-hailing fleet. Gojek operates ride-sharing scooters, food delivery, and digital wallet services in Indonesia, and recently raised $1.5 billion from investors, including Google and Tencent. Gojek plans to operate in Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore, and the Philippines in the coming months. Well, coming up, what was the rollout for Europe's sweeping new data regulation like behind the scenes for one of the biggest tech companies in the world? We will speak with IBM's data protection officer. That's next. And later, we'll discuss Amazon's explanation for an Echo speaker recording and then sending a private conversation to one of their contacts, and if this problem goes beyond Amazon. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Let's continue our discussion of our top story. Europe's new general data protection regulation now in effect. Companies are subject to the most far-reaching data privacy laws aimed at protecting people from losing control of their personal information. Facebook and Google have already been hit with some $9 billion worth of lawsuits arguing the companies are not complying with GDPR. My next guest has been on the front lines of implementing the new rules. Christina Capella, IBM Data Protection Officer, joins us in London, as well as Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde. So, Christina, first of all, these suits filed by an Austrian privacy activist who says that what Google and Facebook have done to comply doesn't go far enough. Do you think this case holds water?
The introduction of GDPR is making a tremendous change in the way society has been looking to technology. It is the time to regain the trust between the technology and society. Clearly, these claims on the very day of the coming into effect of GDPR are explaining how much society is looking for more clarity and transparency in the use of data. So a change will come, but it's also mature the time for rethinking technology in a more trusted, responsible way, so that individuals individuals will gain, again, control of their data and more trust in the way companies use their data.
How hard, or indeed, well, how much of an opportunity has it been with you as the data protection officer implementing that within IBM? Have you had to change the business model in any way to ensure that you are now compliant with GDPR?
We had an advantage in IBM, which was we, since 100 years, have developed a strong practice on security and privacy. As a result, for us, it was more a matter of adjusting and enhancing what we had, but we had a very strong practice on security and privacy. At the same time, we wanted to look at GDPR more as an opportunity than and a challenge. Of course, you need to comply, and therefore that is a challenge in itself,
and
because it's costly, it's true, but it's also, as I said, an opportunity for us as a technology company. Is also an opportunity to support our customers in the banking industry, governments, transportation. We are, since years, their trusted partner.
Christina, IBM has been urging U.S. lawmakers not to adopt GDPR, even sending a big delegation to Washington to lobby against it. Why?
Well, the IBM program for implementing GDPR has been globally adopted. So we wanted to consider GDPR as a good opportunity to enhance our systems in security and privacy around the globe. At the same time, we are a believer of the fact that there is no one-fits-all solution to privacy, really. There are countries and jurisdictions where the cultural dimension and also the rights of individuals are different, because jurisdictionally the rights are different. As a result of that, we believe that there should be the opportunity for countries also to adopt laws and protection to data in a way that is more consistent with those rights. So we are, in a sense, implementing GDPR globally, but at the same time recognizing that other countries may adopt different legislations.
How do you see GDPR materially impacting or changing IBM's business? Will we see an impact of this on the bottom line?
There will be an impact, and we view it as positive, to be honest. And the reason is that it is an opportunity to transform companies and to preparing them for the digital transformation in innovation. In particular, the transformation is about the requirement that GDPR impose on making a bit of cleaning on the data that company has, so that they can manage them and analyze them, and being prepared to leverage also on artificial intelligence and machine learning innovative technologies.
From your point of view, Christina, what is the hardest part of the regulation to satisfy? Is it the fact that it's still open to interpretation, or are there certain elements like the 72-hour rule with a breach or the right to be forgotten that are the biggest hurdles for certain companies?
I believe, and it's also confirmed by studies that we have conducted, that the most difficult part of the regulation is related to the need to have a complete understanding of the data. So the data cleaning, in a sense, is what really is triggering then the possibility to quickly comply with all the other requirements. Data incident you mentioned, but also data subject request. Those are indeed very, very difficult requirement. But if you have control on your data, you are in a position to comply more rapidly to those obligations and with more accuracy. So it's really that is struggling companies, because they have not been used to clean the way data were collected, the way data were used. And that is now making for them more difficult reaching compliance, because still they don't have control.
Yeah, and it's been so difficult for some, particularly in the US, that they've almost for the time being washed their hands of EU clients. Today I tried to log on to history.com or try and get onto the LA Times or the Chicago Tribune, and you can't. It's blocked for 500 million people in the EU. Are many of your clients just deciding that their audience isn't big enough in the EU to really try and scale this?
Now, I think there are different attitudes. There are those that are just taking a very wait-and-see approach. There are those that are starting now to realize that they are losing a competitive advantage if they don't get ready and if they don't open themselves to the global, if you like, reach out of data. And there are those that have started quite early this process and that are, if not ready, I mean very close to be ready. So I'm positive. I believe that the opportunity that GDPR is bringing to the society through the enhancement of the rights of individuals, also to the requirement of more transparency and responsibility and trusted relationship between who manages the data and who owns the data, is good. It's good for individuals, for companies, and for the society.
So, Christina, now that this law is in place, and this is your job, making sure that IBM is in compliance, describe for us what your day-to-day will be like going forward.
Well, I view myself as divided into three fundamental tasks and responsibility. One is to advise the entire company, business units, functions about what they need to do to be compliant and to stay compliant. Because let's remember that compliance is really not just ending today, but continues and is a life cycle of changing and adapting. Second, I need to control that they are compliant. So I have a kind of auditing, if you like, on compliance responsibility. And third, I need to ensure that regulators and authorities are happy with the way we manage the data and in the way we are compliant. So I have also an external facing responsibility to manage the relationship with authorities.
All right, Christina Capella, IBM's Data Protection Officer, thank you so much, as well as Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde in London. Coming up, Amazon is responding to an unlikely series, they say, of miscues picked up by one of its voice-activated Echo speakers during a private conversation. We will have all the details. And this weekend on Bloomberg Television, we'll bring you the best of our interviews from the week, including our conversation in Washington with David O'Sullivan, the EU's ambassador to the United States. You can tune in Saturday for the best of Bloomberg technology. This is Bloomberg. Facing a rebellion among artists and even some of its own employees, Spotify will partially walk back a move to ban musicians for their personal misconduct. The music streaming giant has told artists, managers, and record label executives that it will eventually restore songs by XXX Temptation to playlists, according to people with knowledge of the matter. The company's top execs are now talking to music industry and civil rights activists about how and when to adjust its rules in a manner suitable to both sides. Amazon faced a public blunder this week after it was revealed a voice-activated Echo recorded and sent a private conversation. Amazon has since responded, saying the device woke after hearing a word that sounded like Alexa, which triggers a recording. Then the Echo heard send message in the conversation. The company added, as unlikely as this string of events is, we are evaluating options to make this case even less likely. Although Amazon says it's a rare mistake, it brings up larger anxieties and concerns around the technology and possibilities for voice-activated devices inside the home. We're joined now by Dan Gilmore, Senior Staff Technologist for the Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project at the ACLU in New York. Here with me in San Francisco, we've got our Bloomberg Tech editor, Alistair Barr. So, Alistair, obviously Amazon is emphasizing that this is incredibly unlikely, and yet the fact that it happened at all is worrying and feels like such an invasion of privacy. You know, what should we make of this?
It's a classic payoff between great stuff you get from technology companies and stuff that happens in the background that we give them. A lot of people who bought this device I'm sure didn't read the terms and conditions. They don't know what's happening in the background. So now that this comes out, it's probably going to cause people to be pretty concerned. I imagine the main thing people should do if they're really worried about it is to unplug their Echo device and send it back.
Well, it's not great news for Amazon if that is the case. Dan, you know, are there any laws on the books for monitoring devices like this, or should there be independent audits of them?
There should certainly be independent audits. The fact that we've invited a whole number of computers into our houses and basically with sensors and the ability to record and network connections to send traffic off, represents a real risk to people's privacy and the ability to have, confidential relationships and private communications. This was a situation in someone's living room, but we don't really understand as a society, I think, what it means to have invited this kind of potential surveillance network into our homes.
So, Alistair, as it stands now, these features are opt-out. I mean, is there a way to opt out of these recordings? Or is that just how Alexa works?
We were joking this morning that you should just be able to shout GDPR into the air and then everything shuts down. But I think actually the main thing you can do is there's that button on the top of it and that will switch it off. And we double checked that this morning. If you switch that off, even the Alexa wake word will not turn it back on.
Right, but that's turning it off. You're fully turning it off.
But
what about keeping it on
functionality?
and having some sort of setting where you can opt out? Go ahead, Dan.
You're not really fully turning it. You're not really fully turning it off just by pressing that button, right? The device is a computer. It has some buttons on it. And it has some microphones and some speakers. Pressing the button tells the software in the device to stop recording, but the software might decide to ignore the button as well. These are network-attached computers with all of the problems that network-attached computers have. They can potentially be buggy. They can make mistakes. And so even to the point where we think that the system is physically turned off, the microphone is still probably physically active. There are other technology companies that are starting to build devices.
Would a sort of opt-in feature appease you?
For me personally, definitely not. I wouldn't want one of these devices in my home. I think the only way to get these sort of voice-activated devices is to have one of these computers listening all the time. And that comes with it the kinds of mistakes that happened recently, but it also potentially comes with mistakes that can happen maliciously. It's not enough to engineer these devices well to make sure that you don't accidentally pick something up. There have been a series of adversarial research on how to fool things like the voice recognition systems of Alexa and other technologies. If you want to look up dolphin attack, you can find researchers using things that humans can't even hear to issue control keywords to voice-activated machines. And so these devices need to actually be designed in an adversarial context, not just. It's hard enough to design them in a friendly context, as we can see. But the fact is that they're going to be facing, as the years go by, they'll be facing more and more adversarial interactions. And I think the prospects don't look good for them. I think if people want to be private, it's pretty important to take a second look around you and look at all of the systems that you have in place, the machines that have sensors and that have network capabilities, and consider is the advantage that they give you really worth the privacy risk? I think for most people, the advantage probably is not really worth the risk.
This isn't just limited to Amazon, Alistair. The Google Home Mini, when it was first launched last year, was also sending recordings back to Google. Google scrambled and they said they fixed it. But, when I look at these devices in my house, I definitely think to myself and wonder sometimes what they're hearing.
This has the software on it too, right? And it's technically listening right now too. That was a big snafu for the Google Mini for sure, and they had to issue a software update, which is not reassuring for people at all.
Well, and you make a good point that it's also built into smartphones.
It's certainly built into smartphones. I said goodnight to it last night when I was going to sleep, and it launched some new good night thing where it played me crickets, the sound of crickets, and I couldn't shut it off for about 3 minutes, which was a bit disturbing. But I think Dan's point is the most important one, which is if you want to have a private conversation, you have to unplug these things, right? And then more importantly, on a much longer term basis, people are going to have to make a decision. Do we want to get benefits out of this thing, or do we want privacy?
Right. So Dan, what's the solution here? I mean, is it just say no to technology? Because most people probably aren't going to pick that option.
I'm a software developer. I'm not going to say no to technology, but I do think that the people who are designing and delivering these systems need to think really clearly about the risk that they're effectively exposing their users to. This is a question of stewardship, and the people who provide these tools need to think clearly about how they can ensure that they provide the tools in a way that their users can understand and that give them privacy guarantees that they can understand. There are some manufacturers who are starting to build machines that have sensors in them that can be physically disabled. A physical switch that decouples the microphone from the actual computer would go a long way towards convincing people that the system isn't listening to them when they don't want it to. And that wouldn't be hard for an organization like Amazon or Google to build into their devices. But the companies that build them are often built as part of the surveillance economy, where they tend to actually make their money by monetizing the information that they have about user habits. And so it is, in some sense, in their business interest to continue to gather as much data, and a physical switch might be something that works against them. I think they're going to need to have a reckoning about who their customer is. Is their customer the person who controls the device, or is their customer the advertisers or other people who want to control the users of the devices?
Right. Okay. Dan Gilmore with the ACLU. Thank you, as well as Bloomberg's Alistair Barr. Coming up, we discuss the current state of space exploration and who the players are from the United States, China, and private companies. This is Bloomberg.
Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The global space race is heating up. SpaceX completing its 10th mission of the year this week, launching satellites on its Falcon 9 rocket. SpaceX is keeping up the pace on its ambitious launch schedule of 30 missions for 2018. Meantime, Thursday, President Trump signed his second space policy directive designed to bring government oversight of space travel up to date. For more on the current global space race, I want to welcome Tom Risen, Aerospace America reporter in Washington.
The Shishao satellite, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, launched earlier this week, and it passed by the moon today. It's on its way to a gravitational parking space near the moon, and it's going to relay signals from a lunar rover that the Chinese are going to launch. They aim to launch later this year. It's going to go to the far side of the moon, and it'll be the first rover to ever land, do a soft landing on the far side of the moon that never faces Earth. So they need a relay satellite to send signals from the far side to Earth. So that's what this Shishao satellite is going to be doing.
Meantime, you have President Trump here in the United States focusing on reinvigorating coal and steel industries. You've got a very active private U.S. space community. But how would you say the space race between the United States and China is shaping up?
Yeah, China has invested very heavily in its space industry. It started its space program in the 1990s, and earlier this week it launched a satellite to the moon. It wasn't even its first satellite to the moon, so that's some serious progress. And they have a lot of ambitious plans to go to Mars. They have plans to go to the moon, send humans to the moon. They're hoping to do a sample return mission in 2019, send a rover, bring a sample back. Yes, they're investing very heavily, and they also had a launch of a private company that launched a rocket last week. OneSpace is based in China. It launched a suborbital rocket. So they're definitely going to be a big player. But the big factor is Congress passed a law in 2011 that says NASA cannot work directly with China. So that's something the space community is, they're going to be a big player, and they're thinking about how China can be involved.
So how would you rate the competition between the U.S. private space companies, whether it's SpaceX or Virgin Galactic, Jeff Bezos, Blue Origin, Paul Allen's company? How do they compare?
Well, they're all in various stages of development of rockets. SpaceX, like I mentioned, they're already launching customers on their Falcon 9 rocket, which is not as powerful as the Falcon Heavy. The Falcon Heavy launched in February, and it's a more powerful rocket that could do more complicated missions to deep space. But yeah, other companies are like the Blue Origin is testing its BE-4 rocket on the ground. No, they're testing the engine on the ground, and they hope to launch the New Glenn rocket in 2020. So other companies are still planning to get their rockets with customers out, successfully tested, out in orbit. They're all in various stages.
Now, some sources that I've spoken to at NASA have expressed concern about the safety of the SpaceX program, given the speed at which it is moving forward. Have you heard any of those concerns?
Well, the big concern I think you're talking about is NASA's safety panel is deciding whether they approve of SpaceX fuel loading process they call load and go. What SpaceX does is they keep their fuel at very cold temperatures so that they can fit more of it in the tank. It becomes very dense, and they have to load it very quickly before launch. And they would do it when this is about launching humans. SpaceX has not yet launched humans, but they have the Dragon capsule, and NASA's thinking about whether or not that's safe to load the fuel while astronauts are on the rocket. So that they're still making a decision about that. But SpaceX does test fires of the engine a few days before launch. They did that before they launched this Falcon 9 rocket earlier this week. So they lost 2 of their rockets a few years ago. So they definitely have safety in mind.
All right, Tom Risen from Aerospace America in Washington, thank you so much for joining us. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. We're going to be off this Monday for Memorial Day in the United States, but we will be back on Tuesday, and we will be speaking with the CEO of Cloudflare, Matthew Prince, about the nation's fight in an ongoing cyber war and why attacks are rising. This is Bloomberg.